A single candle sputters against the damp chill as the narrow stone steps plunge into darkness. Each footfall sends a hollow echo through the crumbling foundation of what was once the grand Rutherford estate. The night outside is still, but down here, beneath the warped timbers and mildewed brick, the air feels charged, as if the house itself is holding its breath. 3 figures descend in cautious silence: a local historian, a preservation expert, and the lone cameraman whose lens captures only trembling glimpses of shadow. Their flashlights cut thin blades of light across centuries-old mortar, revealing flaking plaster, moss, and something else. A faint outline of a door that was never meant to be found. The smell of wet stone and rust lingers, sharp enough to taste. For decades, the people of Providence have whispered about this basement. Children dared each other to touch the rotting back door of the Rutherford mansion, claiming they heard soft cries on windless nights. Older neighbors spoke of a sealed chamber beneath the house, of twins who were never seen again after the brutal winter of 1762. Most dismissed it as folklore, until the house, long abandoned, was finally slated for restoration, and the floor plans didn't match the original colonial records. There was an extra space, hidden where no room should exist. The historian presses a palm to the rough outline of stone. It's colder than the surrounding wall. A faint draft seeps from a crack at the edge, carrying a smell like damp earth mixed with something metallic. The cameraman adjusts his focus, and the faint hiss of static distorts the audio for a heartbeat, as if the equipment itself resists what lies ahead. They work the crowbar into the seam. Mortar crumbles in small showers. The sound reverberates like distant thunder, and for a fleeting moment the historian swears he hears something beneath it, an almost childlike sigh, too soft to be the wind. He freezes, heart thudding, but the others continue unaware. Another strike and the stone shifts. Dust fills the air, thick and gritty. The cameraman coughs, and the single candle flares violently, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. When the last stone gives way, a breath of air escapes from the darkness beyond. It's cold and heavy, as if it has waited centuries to be free. The flashlight beams vanish into a chamber that seems to swallow light itself. The preservation expert steps forward, boots scraping against iron. A chain clinks. Something small rolls across the floor, a wooden bead, dark with age. The historian kneels, lifting the bead into the beam of his light. It's the painted eye of a doll, the color long faded but unmistakable. Behind him, the cameraman whispers that the audio is picking up faint interference, soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. None of them speak for a long moment. Stories of the Rutherford family have haunted Providence for generations. Silas Rutherford, the stern merchant with wealth beyond measure. Eleanor, his devout yet secretive wife. And their newborn twins, Clara and Jonah, celebrated as the city's future. Then the storm came. Lanterns failed, the river swelled, and the twins were gone, vanished without trace. Searches of every dock, every frozen pond revealed nothing. Some said the children drowned, others claimed darker forces. No one ever suspected the answers might lie just beneath their feet. The historian steps into the chamber. His light glances off iron rings bolted into the stone floor. Rust blooms around them like dried blood. In the corner, half buried in dust, a child's shoe lies on its side, leather cracked but intact. Above, the ceiling arches low, oppressive like the inside of a tomb. A low creak echoes from somewhere deeper in the darkness. The cameraman swings his light, but the sound has already died. The preservation expert shivers despite the heavy coat. She whispers that the air tastes of metal, of coins left too long in a closed hand. The historian steadies his breath and raises the candle higher. Its flame flickers violently, then steadies, revealing faint markings scratched into the wall, small, frantic etchings that spiral toward the floor. No one speaks. The silence feels alive. Tonight, in this forgotten cellar, the city's oldest legend has become something far more unsettling. What these explorers have found is not merely a room. It is a wound cut deep into Providence's past. A secret sealed by generations who preferred the comfort of rumor to the terror of truth. Somewhere beyond the reach of their lights, the chamber seems to exhale, as though the stones themselves remember. And as the camera's red recording light blinks steadily, One thought presses hard against the historian's mind. The twins who vanished in 1762 never truly left this house. Snow fell in heavy, silent sheets over Providence, turning the crooked lanes and gabled rooftops into a pale, flickering dream. Lanterns burned low behind frosted windows, their glow fighting the endless dark of a New England winter. The year was 1762, and the town's heartbeat pulsed with unease. War rumors drifted from Boston, whispers of rebellion carried on the cold Atlantic wind. But those distant struggles were only part of the tension. Closer to home, Providence faced enemies that felt far more intimate: disease, hunger, and the ancient fear of things that stalked the night. The harbor lay frozen beneath a thin crust of ice, masts creaking like skeletal fingers. Merchants cursed the blockaded trade routes and prayed for warmer weather, their fortunes trapped in the holds of ships that could not move. Streets smelled of tallow smoke and damp wood. The plague that had gripped the colonies 2 years before still haunted memory. Families remembered the sudden fevers, the blackened buboes, the shallow graves dug before sunrise. Even now, when a child coughed behind a shuttered door, neighbors crossed themselves and muttered charms older than the town itself. In the taverns, men argued over the distant king and the taxes he demanded, but when conversation turned low, it always drifted toward older, darker stories of charms to ward off witches, of infants born with the call who could see spirits, of footsteps that followed a man home long after the road behind him was empty. The Puritan ministers thundered from their pulpits about God's wrath, while fortune-tellers worked in secret for those desperate enough to pay. Providence lived in the thin place between faith and superstition, a city that believed both in the Almighty and the things that moved unseen under a winter moon. At the crest of College Hill, where the icy wind swept the drifts into needle-sharp spirals, the Rutherford mansion loomed over the town like a stone sentinel. Built of dark granite hauled from quarries upriver, it rose 3 stories high with a steep roof and narrow windows, each framed by iron shutters. By daylight it seemed a fortress. By night it became something else entirely, its silhouette a blacker shadow against the sky. Servants whispered that the walls were so thick they swallowed sound, that you could scream in the cellar and no one above would hear. Silas Rutherford, the master of that house, was a merchant of uncommon reach. His ships carried molasses and tobacco, rum and cloth across the Atlantic, and it was said that he knew the tides better than the harbor pilots themselves. He moved through Providence with the quiet assurance of a man who could bend trade and politics to his will. His fortune bought him influence in the colonial assembly and the wary respect of men who envied him. Yet he inspired as much unease as admiration. Some swore he dabbled in darker dealings than commerce. Whispers of Caribbean rituals learned on distant voyages, of bargains struck in ports where the church bells never rang. His wife, Eleanor, was another enigma. Born to an old Rhode Island family, she carried herself with the poise of someone raised among books and silver. Yet neighbors noticed how rarely she joined the tea circles or market chatter. They spoke of her solitary walks at dusk, of the way she kept the curtains drawn even in summer. When she finally bore children, twins, a boy and a girl, Providence buzzed with speculation. Some saw them as a blessing, a sign that the Rutherfords' cold house would finally be warmed by laughter. Others whispered that twins were a portent, 2 souls bound by fate and mystery, destined to bring either fortune or ruin. As the winter deepened, so did the town's unease. Wolves prowled the outskirts, their howls slicing through the night like splintered glass. Smallpox claimed 3 children in a single week. A fisherman swore he saw strange lights flicker near the Rutherford grounds, will-o'-the-wisps that vanished when approached. The ministers preached repentance, their words sharp enough to draw blood. Providence was a city balanced on a knife's edge, ready to believe that something wicked could be born in its midst. Inside the Rutherford mansion, the hearths burned bright, and the scent of imported spices drifted through the halls. Servants moved quickly, eyes lowered, for the master's temper was as sudden as the Atlantic squalls. Behind the heavy oak doors of the nursery, the twins slept side by side, their small breaths clouding the chill air. Clara's tiny hand rested on her brother Jonah's chest, rising and falling with his heartbeat. They were a picture of innocence, yet even the most practical servant felt a prickle at the back of the neck when the wind howled through the eaves. Outside, Providence crouched beneath its blanket of snow, listening. The town had survived harsh winters before, but this year felt different. There was a weight to the silence, a sense that something unseen moved through the narrow lanes and the frozen harbor. Old fears, never far from the surface, began to stir, and at the center of it all stood the Rutherford mansion, its dark windows watching, waiting, as if the stones themselves knew a secret the rest of the city was about to learn. Silas Rutherford's name was spoken in Providence with a careful mix of admiration and unease. He was a man carved from the sea and the markets it fed, a shipping merchant whose ventures stretched from the cold waters of Newfoundland to the humid ports of the Caribbean. His fortune seemed inexhaustible. New houses rose on the strength of his coin, and the docks thrived under the weight of his ship's cargo, molasses, tobacco, exotic spices that perfumed the wharves. To the casual eye, he was a pillar of colonial prosperity, a man whose handshake could steady a wavering venture. Yet behind the public respect lay rumors that clung like salt to the air. Rivals whispered of deals struck in back alleys and contracts written in blood. Sailors muttered that his wealth grew fastest when storms sank the competition, as if the ocean itself favored him or feared to cross him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and as spare with words as he was ruthless in trade. His eyes, a cold steel gray, weighed people like cargo. When Silas strode through the marketplace, apprentices lowered their gaze and even seasoned merchants tempered their haggling. He spoke seldom of family or faith, but he never missed a ship's departure, no matter the hour or weather. Some said he was married to the sea more than to any living soul. Eleanor Rutherford, by contrast, moved like a figure glimpsed through fog. Born to the old Whitcomb family of Newport, she had been a celebrated beauty in her youth, though beauty in her case was less about the bloom of her face than the quiet magnetism she carried. She seemed to glide rather than walk, her presence at once graceful and distant. After her marriage to Silas, she withdrew from the society that once adored her. Invitations to teas and musicales went politely unanswered. Neighbors saw her only during brief Sunday appearances at the First Congregational Church, where she sat motionless, eyes lowered, lips moving in silent prayer that did not quite match the minister's cadence. Those who worked within the Rutherford mansion spoke in low voices of her habits, how she lit a single candle long after midnight and knelt before it for hours, how she kept certain rooms locked and forbade even trusted servants to enter. The cook once swore she heard Eleanor humming a melody in a language she did not recognize, a tune that made the hairs rise on the back of her neck. Others claimed Eleanor walked the gardens barefoot even in winter, as if the earth itself had called her. Whether these were the exaggerations of gossip or the reflections of something deeper, no one could say. For years, the grand house on College Hill remained silent of children's laughter. The couple's marriage, some whispered, was as barren as the rocky soil beyond the town's borders. Then, after nearly a decade, word spread like wildfire. Eleanor was with child. Providence, hungry for omens and blessings in a season of harsh winters and political unrest, seized on the news. When the birth brought not one child, but two, a boy and a girl, excitement bordered on reverence. Clara and Jonah entered the world on a night when the harbor ice cracked under a sudden thaw, as if nature itself acknowledged their arrival. Neighbors said the bells of every ship in port rang without a hand to pull the ropes. Midwives, still flushed from the delivery, spoke of an uncanny stillness in the infant's first cries, a pause that felt deliberate, as though they were listening before they chose to breathe. Silas, normally so controlled, allowed himself a rare smile that the servants would speak of for years. Eleanor, pale but radiant, held the twins to her chest, with a fierceness that seemed almost protective against the world itself. The birth of twins was rare enough to ignite every superstition lurking in colonial minds. Some saw it as a double blessing, a sign that Providence itself favored the Rutherford name. Merchants whispered of fortunes doubled, of trade winds forever fair. Yet others muttered of ancient portents. Two souls bound together might attract jealous spirits, One life might be destined to shield the other from calamity. When the town's minister christened them, the water in the font shimmered strangely in the candlelight, and several witnesses later swore they felt a sudden draught sweep the church, though the doors were closed. Silas took pride in presenting his heirs to the world, but even in celebration, his eyes held a calculating gleam, as if measuring how these children might someday extend his dominion. He commissioned an elaborate nursery lined with imported silk and mahogany cradles, yet he installed heavy shutters that kept the room in a perpetual twilight. Eleanor, meanwhile, seemed to drift further inward. She dismissed wet nurses and insisted on tending to the twins herself, rarely allowing them out of her sight. Servants who carried trays to the nursery described the air as unnaturally still, heavy with a scent they could not place. Some claimed the babies watched them with a depth of awareness unsettling for such small faces. By the summer following their birth, the Rutherford mansion had become both a place of fascination and quiet dread. Visitors marveled at the wealth displayed in its carved banisters and gleaming chandeliers, but they left with a lingering chill, as though the house exhaled something it wished to keep hidden. Clara and Jonah grew strong and beautiful, their matching blue-gray eyes reflecting the stormy Atlantic. To many they were the embodiment of Providence's promise, prosperity, endurance, and the mysterious power of a name spoken with both reverence and fear. Yet beneath the gilded veneer, a question flickered like a candle in a draught. What bargain had secured these children's lives, and what price might one day be exacted? The first sounds came on a night of hard frost, when the moon carved the Rutherford mansion into a black silhouette against the snow. Martha, the eldest housemaid, woke to what she thought was the scurry of rats in the walls. The noise was too deliberate, though. Slow, dragging scratches that rose and fell in a rhythm like someone testing the stone with fingernails. She held her breath and pressed an ear to the cold plaster. The sound paused, then returned, a faint scrape followed by what might have been a sigh. By morning the walls were silent and Martha told no one. In the Rutherford household, silence was safer than questions. Days passed, but the noises grew bolder. The butler heard a child's whimper echo down the stairwell, though both twins were said to be asleep in their nursery. A kitchen boy swore he heard soft humming beneath the floorboards as he banked the evening fire. At first they blamed the winter wind or the groaning timbers of the old house, but the pattern sharpened until no one could pretend it was chance. Always after midnight, always near the nursery, servants began to avoid the upper corridors after dark. They moved quickly when called to fetch Eleanor or Silas, whispering prayers under their breath as they passed the locked door of the children's room. Some mornings they found faint lines etched in the dust along the baseboards, as if tiny fingers had reached for a way out. When they reported these things to Mrs. Greeley, the stern housekeeper, she tightened her jaw and warned them to hold their tongues. "The master has ears everywhere," she said. "Best not to invite his attention." Outside the mansion, rumors stirred like embers. Market women who once caught glimpses of the twins at the window noticed their absence. Weeks turned to months without a single public appearance. Neighbors who offered congratulations after the birth began to wonder why the children were never carried to church or paraded through the square, as wealthy families often did. A milkman delivering before dawn claimed he saw Eleanor on the balcony, rocking an empty cradle in the moonlight. Another swore that he heard a child crying, even as every window remained shuttered tight. Silas dismissed such talk with the precision of a man accustomed to command. To the few merchants bold enough to inquire, he said the children were delicate, their health too precious for the rough winter air. He reinforced his gates and hired new watchmen, men with flintlocks and orders to turn away the curious. The mansion grew into a fortress, its stone walls holding not just warmth but secrets. Eleanor, meanwhile, seemed to drift further into an unreachable world. Once merely reserved, she became nearly spectral, appearing at odd hours with a fevered brightness in her eyes. Servants reported finding her kneeling in the cold chapel room long after midnight, murmuring prayers that looped into fragments: purity, cleansing, deliverance. She scoured the house with scented oils and demanded the washing of walls and floors until the air stung with lye. When Martha timidly asked the reason, Eleanor spoke of keeping the children untouched by the corruption outside. Her words fed a deeper unease. Purity was a common sermon in colonial pulpits, but in Eleanor's mouth it sounded like obsession. She dismissed the town minister's offers to visit, claiming only she could safeguard the twins' souls. When Silas returned from voyages, neighbors heard raised voices through the stone, his deep thunder, her sharp plea. Some nights the argument ended in silence so abrupt it felt like a held breath. By late spring the servants' fear hardened into dread. They confided in each other in the scullery, trading tales of muffled cries that seemed to echo through the chimney or down the hidden servants' stair. The scratching came more often now, frantic bursts followed by sudden stillness. A footman swore he heard a child call his name in a whisper, though no one stood behind him. Sleep became scarce. More than one servant quietly left, refusing to collect final wages. Outside, the town watched and speculated. Children dared each other to touch the iron gates at night. Housewives crossed themselves when the mansion's shutters rattled without wind. The minister preached a sermon about sins hidden in stone houses, and half the congregation glanced toward College Hill. Providence had always been quick to believe in witchcraft and curses, but the Rutherfords gave those old fears new shape. Silas responded by tightening his control. He reduced the staff to a skeleton crew and barred anyone from the nursery except Eleanor and himself. Deliveries were left at the gate, payment in sealed envelopes. When a physician arrived uninvited, he was turned away at gunpoint. The message was clear. The children's welfare was a family matter, not the town's concern. Still, the whispers traveled through the cold air like smoke. Some said the twins had been touched by the devil, their souls marked from birth. Others insisted Silas sought to create angels untainted by the world, keeping them away from light itself. A few, remembering the lost infants of past winters, feared a simpler but more terrible truth, that the children no longer lived, and that the scratching in the walls was something else entirely. By midsummer, the mansion stood aloof under the sun, shutters closed, garden overgrown, a dark monolith against the blue sky. At night, when the moon climbed high and the harbor lay quiet, the faint sounds returned, scratches, sighs, a muffled cry. Neighbors lay awake in their beds listening, certain the stone itself was trying to speak. Inside, the servants who remained did not need convincing. They knew the house was alive with secrets, and whatever moved behind those walls was no mere rat or restless wind. The storm came without warning, a sudden rage of wind and water that turned the late autumn sky black before the noon bells finished ringing. By dusk, the harbor writhed under walls of icy rain, and the streets of Providence became rushing rivers of mud. Lanterns guttered in the gale, flames sputtering out one by one until only the occasional flash of lightning gave shape to the world. From College Hill, the Rutherford mansion loomed like a ship lost in fog, its stone walls glistening under sheets of rain. Inside, servants fought to keep the hearths alive. But each gust howled down the chimneys and smothered the flames. The nursery shutters slammed against their locks with a hollow boom. Eleanor Rutherford moved from room to room with a candle cupped in her trembling hand, her pale face lit by a flickering halo. She whispered prayers beneath her breath, half scripture, half plea, as thunder cracked so violently the windows rattled in their frames. When the lightning struck the iron gate, every candle in the house flared and died. For an instant the mansion was blind. Darkness rolled through the halls like a living thing. Martha, the housemaid, groped for Flint, her heart beat a frantic drum. Somewhere above, a thin cry pierced the roar of the storm, a child's voice sharp with fear, then silence. By the time the servants reached the nursery, the wind had stilled to a heavy hush. The door stood ajar, rocking slightly as if touched by an unseen hand. Inside, the room smelled of damp stone and something faintly metallic. The cradles were empty. The search began before dawn, a frantic scouring of every corridor and cellar. Silas Rutherford led the way, a lantern finally lit in his fist, jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped with each heartbeat. They pried open storage chests, yanked aside heavy drapes, even climbed to the rafters, but found no trace of Clara or Jonah. Not a scrap of cloth, not a footprint in the dust, only the sound of the storm receding into a grey, watchful silence. Word spread through Providence like a spark on dry tinder. Neighbors poured from their homes, forming search parties that combed the hilltop grounds. Men with torches waded into the swollen river despite the bitter cold, dragging poles through the dark water. Women gathered in the church to pray, their voices rising over the echo of the bells that tolled for lost souls. Children were ordered inside, yet many pressed their faces to frosted panes, hoping for a glimpse of the twins, whose names they'd whispered with both envy and fear. Theories multiplied as the hours stretched. Some said the children had wandered into the storm and been swept to the sea. Others murmured of kidnappers, pirates come ashore to ransom the wealthy merchants' heirs. The old women of the market, less cautious, spoke of darker forces, a curse paid in innocent blood, a bargain the parents could no longer keep. Silas addressed the gathering crowd only once, standing on the mansion's rain-slick steps as the wind whipped his cloak. His words were measured and cold. The children, he said, were lost but not dead. He assured the town that every effort was being made and that his own men, experienced sailors and scouts, would scour the land and river. Questions shouted from the crowd went unanswered. With a curt nod, he turned back into the house, the door closing like a final verdict. Eleanor did not appear beside him. Those few who caught glimpses of her in the days that followed swore she moved like a phantom, her eyes rimmed with sleepless shadow. She neither wept nor spoke to anyone outside the household. At night she wandered the mansion with a single candle, pausing at walls as if she could hear voices behind the stone. Servants sometimes found her in the chapel room at dawn, kneeling on the bare floor, lips cracked from prayer. The official search stretched for a week. Volunteers dragged the river until their arms ached, scoured the marshes and the rocky coves along the bay. Dogs were brought in but balked at the mansion's gates, whining and pulling away. Not a shred of fabric, not a footprint, not a drop of blood emerged. The twins had vanished as if the storm had swallowed them whole. As the town's hope waned, gossip thickened. Some claimed they heard faint cries on windless nights, drifting down from College Hill. A ferryman swore he saw a woman in white walking the riverbank, lantern held low, her reflection absent from the water. The minister spoke of divine tests and the mystery of God's will, but his sermons carried a tremor he could not hide. Silas grew harsher with each passing day. He dismissed half the servants, accusing them of negligence, and forbade anyone from stepping beyond the gates without his leave. When a magistrate suggested searching the house again, Silas's reply was a door slammed in his face. He hired guards to patrol the perimeter and wrote letters long into the night, their contents known only to him. Eleanor drifted further into shadow. Sometimes she stood for hours at the nursery door, staring into the empty room. Other times she disappeared into the lower corridors where the walls sweated with damp and the air smelled of rust. The remaining servants began to leave quietly, one by one, unwilling to stay in a house that seemed to breathe sorrow. By the first snowfall, the Rutherfords were alone in their fortress of stone. The town below settled into uneasy silence, but the legend was already taking root. People spoke of the storm as if it were alive, a thing that came to collect a debt. They said the twins had not been taken by river or sea, but by something older, something the stones of the mansion themselves would not release. And in the long, dark nights that followed, those who lived nearest to College Hill sometimes woke to a sound they could not explain. A faint scratching carried on the winter wind, as if two small hands were trying still to find their way back. Beneath the Rutherford mansion, the air smelled of damp lime and cold stone, a scent that clung to the memory of every tradesman who had ever worked its foundations. In the spring of 1781, nearly 2 decades after the twins' disappearance, a stonemason named Caleb Brigham arrived to mend a hairline crack, running like a pale scar across the eastern cellar wall. He came at dawn, when the rest of Providence still slumbered under a mist that made the harbor look like a blank sheet of parchment. The house loomed in silence above him, its slate roof black against the paling sky, its chimneys cold. Caleb worked alone, his mallet tapping a steady rhythm that echoed strangely in the stillness. Each strike seemed to carry farther than the walls should allow, as if the stone itself were hollow. When he paused to drink from his flask, he heard it, A faint sound below the floor, a thin metallic clink followed by something softer, almost like a sigh. He knelt, pressing his ear to the wall. At first he thought it was the moan of a settling house, but then came a second sound. A hushed murmur, impossibly human, as though a whisper had traveled up from the earth. His skin prickled. He struck again, testing. The echo came back wrong, a hollow thud that betrayed a void behind the mortar. Caleb set down his tools and traced the outline of the stonework with a trembling finger. One section, a perfect rectangle, bore newer mortar than the rest, slightly darker, as if it had been set in haste years ago. He tapped it with the handle of his chisel and felt a faint draft, a breath of air that smelled of iron and something older, something long sealed. He fetched the lady of the house, a distant cousin of the long-dead Rutherfords who had inherited the property. Her face blanched when he described what he'd found. The household servants, drawn by the commotion, huddled at the cellar steps, eyes wide with the old rumors that had never quite died. Someone crossed themselves, another muttered a prayer. The lady insisted on fetching the town constable before any stone was moved. By afternoon, word had spread through Providence like wildfire. A small crowd gathered in the muddy yard, boots sinking as they craned for a view through the cellar door. Old women who still remembered the twins whispered that the house had always been cursed, that the storm of '62 had left more than fallen branches in its wake. Men who had once joined the frantic river searches stood with folded arms, faces tight with a grim curiosity. When the constable arrived, he ordered the false wall breached. Caleb swung his mallet with a force that rattled the timbers. Mortar cracked, sending a thin cloud of chalky dust into the air. A single stone loosened and fell inward with a muted clatter. A cold draft rushed out, carrying a smell like rust and damp linen. Behind the wall, darkness yawned. Lanterns were lit. Their flickering glow revealed a narrow archway descending into blackness. The staircase was steep and rough-hewn, its edges wet with condensation, as if it had been carved directly from the bedrock and forgotten. The constable hesitated at the threshold. Behind him the crowd shifted, uneasy. No map of the mansion had ever shown such a stair. No deed or blueprint suggested another level below the cellar. The first step groaned under his weight, a sound swallowed quickly by the thick air below. One by one the party descended, the lanterns painting trembling halos on the slick stone walls. Each footfall echoed with a hollowness that felt too deliberate, too crafted to be an accident of architecture. Halfway down, a second passage branched off and vanished into shadow. The cold draft stronger there, as if the earth itself exhaled secrets. When the stair finally ended, they found a low chamber barely high enough to stand in. The walls were lined with wood long since blackened by moisture. Chains hung from iron rings sunk deep into the stone. A single child's shoe lay in the center of the floor, its leather shriveled with age, its buckle dulled to gray. The silence was so complete it pressed against their ears like a weight. Someone whispered a name, one of the twins, though no one could recall who had spoken first. The constable's lantern flickered, casting quick shadows that leapt like figures retreating into corners. Behind them, faint and unmistakable, came a sound none of them would ever forget. The soft rattle of chains stirred by no visible hand. They fled the chamber in a rush of clanging boots and sharp breaths, bursting into the gray daylight with faces white as limestone. Outside, the crowd surged forward with questions, but the constable could only shake his head, eyes fixed on the cellar door, as if the darkness might follow them out. By nightfall, the story had raced through Providence, of a hidden stairwell, of the cold breath of the earth, of the relics of children long lost. The city's old fears rekindled like embers catching wind, and with them grew a single, terrible certainty. The Rutherford's basement had never been empty. Lantern light swayed in the heavy air, scattering thin blades of gold across the chamber's blackened walls. The townsmen stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath clouding in the damp cold as they pushed farther into the hidden room. The deeper they stepped, the more the space seemed to close around them, as though the earth itself wanted to keep its secrets. The smell was sharper now, metal and mildew laced with something faintly sweet, like rotting wood after a rain. Iron rings, thick as a man's wrist, jutted from the stone floor in a precise circle. Each bore a length of corroded chain, their ends clamped shut with locks that had long since rusted. When the constable kicked one with his boot, it gave a low groan that echoed through the chamber and vanished into the unseen corridors beyond. Beside the rings lay fragments of cloth the color of old bone, the weave so fine it could only have belonged to a family of means. One of the younger men crouched and brushed aside a layer of grit. His fingers uncovered a tiny wooden soldier, its paint faded to ghostly pastels, the toy's carved face worn smooth by small hands. Nearby, half buried in dust, lay the porcelain head of a doll, the delicate cheeks cracked into a crooked smile. A child's rattle, a set of jacks, a length of ribbon dulled to gray. Each object emerged like a whisper from the past, proof of life that had once breathed in this place. A sudden scrape broke the silence. The mason, Caleb, had shifted a stone near the far wall and revealed a dark hollow beneath. He reached in and drew out what looked like a bundle of sticks, but the lantern glow betrayed the truth. Tiny ribs, fragile as bird bones, curved beneath a scrap of rotted linen. Another man uncovered a skull no larger than an apple, its teeth barely budded. The room filled with the sound of hurried prayers and muffled oaths. Closer inspection revealed the walls themselves bore marks, a lattice of shallow scratches that started near the floor and climbed upward in desperate, uneven lines. Some ended in jagged bursts where the stone had flaked under frantic hands. The constable traced a claw mark with his gloved finger and swallowed hard. These were not the scars of rats or time. They were human. Word spread quickly, and by the next day, physicians and scholars from the city arrived to examine the chamber. They moved methodically, measuring and cataloguing, yet the weight of the place made every voice hush to a reverent murmur. One physician lifted a lantern to the ceiling and noted faint discolorations, streaks where smoke had once curled upward. He concluded that small fires had been lit here, carefully tended to keep captives alive, but never strong enough to betray a chimney's smoke above ground. Among the debris, a leather-bound packet emerged, the edges brittle and flaking. Inside were loose pages scrawled in a delicate hand. Ink had bled in places, but enough remained to chill even the most skeptical. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, and the signature ER left no doubt. They were fragments of Eleanor Rutherford's diary. The entries were brief, each a trembling prayer and a justification. "The children must be cleansed," read one, the words etched with obsessive care. "The Lord demands purity before the storm passes." Another, dated months later, declared, "Their cries are trials for my soul. To keep them is mercy. To release them is damnation." The final legible line, nearly illegible beneath a water stain, whispered, "Light is the great deceiver." As the investigators pieced together the evidence, a grim narrative formed. The iron rings and chains spoke of deliberate confinement. The toys, the small bones, the frantic claw marks, all told of lives spent in darkness. Eleanor's words suggested a fevered belief that isolation would somehow redeem her children, perhaps shielding them from a world she saw as corrupt. Silas Rutherford's absence from the pages only deepened the mystery. Was he complicit or merely a man who looked away? Outside, Providence reeled. Crowds gathered at the gates, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the night. Ministers thundered from pulpits about sin and secrecy. Mothers clutched their children tighter, imagining the cold stone beneath their own feet. The once proud Rutherford mansion became a pilgrimage site for the morbidly curious and the devout alike. A place where whispers of witchcraft and divine punishment mingled with the acrid scent of unearthed tragedy. As dusk fell on the second evening of excavation, the chamber seemed to resist further intrusion. Lanterns sputtered in sudden drafts, tools dulled quickly, as if the stone itself wished to remain untouched. Caleb, who had first heard the mysterious echoes, claimed he felt a vibration through the floor, a low hum like a buried heartbeat. Whether it was the tremor of his own nerves or something older, he could not say. The diary pages were carefully sealed and taken to the magistrate's office, but their words lingered in every corner of the house. Light is the great deceiver. Each investigator who read that final line felt a private shiver, as if Eleanor's warning was not merely a confession, but a prophecy. Long after the chamber was emptied and the remains given a proper burial, people swore the mansion's stones held a memory of small voices, a faint rustle beneath the soil when the wind rose from the harbor. What lay beneath the Rutherford house was more than a crime scene. It was a testament to the terrible power of belief and the fragility of innocence, a place where faith had hardened into cruelty and silence had become a weapon. And though the chamber was finally open to the light, many whispered that some doors, once sealed, are never truly undone. The courthouse smelled of damp wool and fear. Rain hammered the slate roof in relentless waves, a fitting percussion for the storm that had gathered around the Rutherford name. Lanterns hissed and guttered in the drafty chamber as the townspeople pressed shoulder to shoulder on the benches, their faces pale ovals of expectation. The discovery beneath the Rutherford mansion had already spread beyond Providence, drawing merchants from Boston, ministers from New Haven, even a newspaperman from far-off Philadelphia. All wanted to witness the trial of Silas Rutherford, the shipping magnate now whispered about as a jailer of children and a servant of dark faith. When Silas entered, the room tilted with murmurs. He cut a severe figure, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in somber black with a silver clasp at his throat. His grey eyes swept the crowd without a flicker of shame, as if the judgment of mere mortals scarcely concerned him. Behind him, the empty chair where Eleanor should have sat remained conspicuously vacant. She had not been seen since the discovery of the hidden chamber. Some claimed she had fled. Others swore she had retreated into a silence so deep no earthly summons could draw her out. The magistrate called the court to order, his gavel echoing like a gunshot. The charges, unlawful imprisonment, neglect resulting in death, acts of unnatural cruelty, rang out in the stillness. Silas stood motionless, his hands clasped behind his back, a man carved of granite. When asked for his plea, his voice came low and resonant. "Not guilty, for I have obeyed the will of the Almighty." A shiver traveled through the gallery, like a sudden gust of cold wind. The prosecution began with testimony from the tradesman Caleb Brigham, whose discovery of the false wall had unearthed the horror. His account of the iron rings and the tiny bones drew gasps and muffled sobs. He described the claw marks, the toys coated in years of dust, and the final unsettling sound of chains rattling in the dark when no one moved. At this, a woman in the gallery fainted and was carried out, her limp form adding a grim underscore to his words. Next came the servants who had worked in the house during the twins' infancy. One by one they recounted nights broken by soft wails that seemed to seep from the very stones, of orders to remain upstairs after dusk, of food trays left outside locked doors and later retrieved empty but never with a glimpse of the children. "I thought them sickly," whispered an aging maid, her wrinkled hands twisting a kerchief. "Miss Eleanor said they must be kept from the world to keep them pure. I feared to question her." Another servant swore he had heard small voices singing hymns in the dead of night. The sound cut short as though smothered by a heavy cloth. Neighbors followed, recalling how the twins were rarely seen after their christening. One fisherman spoke of nights when he heard faint cries carried on the harbor wind, like gulls but sorrowful, pleading. A merchant's wife remembered Eleanor buying unusual amounts of tallow and salt, insisting it was to keep unholy shadows from the house. Each testimony layered dread upon dread until the courtroom seemed to breathe with the collective unease of the colony. When it came time for the defense, Silas demanded to speak for himself. Rising with the gravity of a preacher, he addressed the court in a voice that filled every corner of the chamber. "Providence itself guided my hand," he declared. "The world beyond my walls is a pit of corruption. The Lord commands his faithful to guard the innocent from its stain. My children were chosen, sanctified by isolation. Their earthly suffering is but the crucible of eternal salvation." A murmur surged through the crowd. The magistrate rapped for silence, but Silas pressed on, eyes blazing. "Would you condemn a father for saving his offspring from damnation? Their bodies may have returned to dust, but their souls are unblemished. I am the instrument of divine mandate, and no mortal court may judge me." The prosecutor countered with the diary fragments, reading Eleanor's trembling words aloud until the chamber felt haunted by her presence. "The children must be cleansed." "Light is the great deceiver." Gasps punctuated each phrase. Some in the gallery crossed themselves. Others glared at Silas with open hatred. Still, he stood unbowed, lips curved in a faint, unreadable smile. The jury deliberated through a night of pounding rain and restless whispers. Outside, townspeople clustered under dripping eaves, trading stories of curses and retribution. Some swore they saw flickers of pale light in the windows of the Rutherford mansion, as though unseen figures kept vigil. By morning, when the gavel called them back, a tense hush fell over the court. The foreman's voice wavered only once as he read the verdict, guilty on all counts. A cheer burst from the gallery, quickly stifled by the magistrate's command for order. Sentence was pronounced. Life imprisonment at the Newgate facility in Connecticut, a place of darkness to match the cellar he had built. Yet as the constables stepped forward, Silas raised his voice once more, calm and cold. "This judgment is not the end," he intoned. "The blood of the righteous calls for reckoning. My line shall not die, and those who condemn me will taste the curse." A sudden crack of thunder shook the timbers overhead, drawing startled cries. Silas did not flinch. He allowed the irons to be clasped around his wrists with the serenity of a man convinced of his own immortality. As he was led away, a strange hush swept the chamber, as though the air itself recoiled. Some swore the lanterns dimmed without cause. Others insisted they felt a faint tremor beneath the floor, like the heartbeat of something vast and unseen. In the weeks that followed, rumors multiplied faster than broadsheets could print them. Ships carrying Rutherford goods foundered inexplicably off the coast. A magistrate who had spoken harshly against Silas took ill and died within days. Children in the neighborhood woke screaming of voices in their dreams. Whether coincidence or curse, the colonies whispered that the Rutherfords were not finished. The mansion stood empty, its windows staring blankly over the harbor, a monument to a family whose sins had seeped into the very stones. And as autumn winds howled through Providence, many swore they heard, beneath the gale, the faint echo of a father's vow, that his bloodline would outlive judgment, and that the debt was only beginning to be paid. By the turn of the 19th century, the Rutherford mansion stood like a husk on the bluff above Providence harbor, its slate roof sagging and shutters hanging askew. Salt winds from the Atlantic gnawed at its stones, and ivy crawled up the walls like dark veins. Sailors returning from long voyages claimed they could see a pale shimmer in the upper windows on moonless nights, a flicker that vanished the moment they looked twice. No one cared to purchase the property, though the price was lowered again and again. The rumor was that Silas Rutherford's curse clung to the mortar itself. Children of the town made a game of running to the warped front gates after dusk, daring each other to slip a hand through the iron bars and touch the rusted lock. They would squeal and scatter when a gull cried overhead, half laughing, half certain the house breathed with them. Some said the lock burned cold against the skin, as if ice lay beneath the metal. Others swore they heard faint scratching from deep within the earth, a sound that grew sharper the longer one listened. When a daring merchant finally bought the place in 1823, he lasted less than 2 winters. His servants fled first, claiming footsteps followed them through empty halls. Doors slammed, though every window was latched tight, and one maid awoke to the sound of chains rattling under her bed. The merchant himself was found one spring morning wandering the harbor docks in his nightshirt, eyes wide and vacant, murmuring that the children want the light back. He sold the mansion for a fraction of its worth and refused to speak of it again. Through the decades, the house passed from owner to owner, each departure more abrupt than the last. A sea captain who tried to renovate found his tools inexplicably dulled overnight. A pair of Boston investors sent workers to demolish the cellar, only for the crew to flee at dusk, pale and silent, leaving their wages untouched. Local papers recorded these events with a mix of skepticism and glee, feeding a legend that no rational voice could quiet. By the late 1800s, Historians began to treat the Rutherford story as both cautionary tale and puzzle. Scholars pored over surviving court documents and Eleanor's water-stained diary fragments, arguing over whether Silas's so-called curse was mere theatre or something stranger. Spiritualists of the Victorian era flocked to the mansion with planchettes and candles, claiming to hear children's voices in the walls. Skeptics countered that the hidden chamber's acoustics created natural echoes that unsettled the imagination. Yet even the most hardened doubters admitted to an unease that lingered long after they left. As electricity lit the streets of Providence, the mansion remained stubbornly dark. Local youths, emboldened by the century's progress, turned it into a rite of passage. On Halloween nights, they crept across the overgrown grounds, hearts hammering as they approached the cellar doors, now sealed with heavy oak planks. They told each other stories of a phantom mother who whispered hymns from the stairwell, of a shadowed figure that appeared in the lantern glow only to dissolve when named. Daring hands reached out to touch the ancient padlock, and more than one child ran home with a sudden chill creeping up their arm, swearing it pulsed like a heartbeat. In the 20th century, universities debated the site's future. Some argued for preservation as a monument to colonial tragedy. Others demanded its destruction to break the spell of fear that still gripped the neighborhood. Each proposal stalled. Surveyors reported inexplicable equipment failures. A team sent to map the subcellar found their photographs fogged by streaks of white light. The city quietly decided to leave the house to its own slow decay. Now the mansion stands as a silhouette against the harbor mist, windows blind with dust, doors chained by rust and rumor. Travelers who pass at night still claim to hear the faint rattle of metal from beneath the stones, as though a memory refuses to die. Local children continue their age-old game, daring one another to touch the sealed door, their laughter mingling with the wind. And when the moon is thin and the tide runs high, the old people of Providence swear the house exhales a long, cold breath that carries the echo of small voices calling from a darkness older than time. The morning sun filtered through a gauze of harbor fog as the excavation crew gathered at the Rutherford site, now little more than a shell of ivy-choked stone. Decades of debate had finally yielded a decision. The property would be stabilized, its hidden chamber documented once and for all, before the mansion was sealed for public safety. Archaeologists set up their tripods and scanners, their equipment blinking with quiet precision. To them it was a historic dig. But the townspeople who lingered beyond the caution tape watched with an almost superstitious tension, as if a sleeping animal were about to stir. The first layers of soil came away easily, a crumble of centuries-old dust. Beneath lay the original flagstones of the secret chamber, their surface slick with subterranean damp. Sensors mapped voids below the stairwell, suggesting pockets of earth that had escaped the earliest investigations. As the team pried up a section of stone near the far wall, a cool draft spiraled upward, carrying a metallic scent that cut through the salt air outside. One of the younger archaeologists paused, claiming he heard a faint metallic rattle, an echo like a distant chain, but the others dismissed it as the groan of shifting rock. An hour later, the trowel of a graduate student struck something not quite stone. The scrape rang sharp, almost hollow. She knelt, brushing away sediment until the curve of a small skull emerged, delicate as a bird's egg. A second, slightly larger skull appeared inches away. Both were positioned on their sides, facing one another, the thin bones of their tiny hands still laced together despite the centuries. Gasps rippled through the chamber. The silence that followed was so complete the hiss of the lantern seemed deafening. Careful brushing revealed more. The faint outline of child-sized ribs, the remnants of fine linen garments fused with the earth. There were no shackles here, no chains to explain the embrace. It was as though the twins had lain down in a final act of comfort, their bond unbroken even in death. A forensic pathologist whispered measurements, voice catching as she noted the signs of slow starvation, the fragile growth plates of children who had lived, then waited in darkness. Above ground, word spread fast. Reporters crowded the perimeter, their cameras flashing like errant lightning. The discovery confirmed what generations of rumor had only hinted. Clara and Jonah Rutherford, had never escaped that basement. They had died together in the hidden room their mother believed was holy and their father defended as divinely ordained. Historians gathered that afternoon to speak on camera. One quoted Eleanor's final diary line, "Light is the great deceiver," and wondered aloud how belief can harden into cruelty. Another reminded the crowd that Providence had known of the children's disappearance and yet allowed the mansion to stand for decades, its secrets unchallenged. "We like to think monsters are obvious," she said, her voice trembling. "But history shows we are capable of stepping around horror if it wears the mask of respectability." As evening fell, the excavation lights cast long, trembling shadows across the ruined foundation. Townsfolk who had come to witness the end of the legend lingered in uneasy silence. A boy no older than the twins had been edged closer to the caution tape and stared down the dark stairwell. He said he felt a breeze rise from below, colder than the autumn night, and pulled his coat tight though the air around him was still. When the crew finally secured the chamber and packed their equipment, the mansion seemed to exhale a final sigh. Yet even as the site emptied, an unease remained. The archaeologists locked the gate, but a faint rattle echoed from the depths, a sound the wind alone could not explain. The town council promised a memorial, a plaque to honor Clara and Jonah, but older residents shook their heads. They remembered the merchant who lost his mind, the sea captain's dulled tools, the children's games of touching the sealed door and running home with ice in their veins. They warned that some stories do not end with discovery. Late that night, after the last generator fell silent, a single light appeared in the uppermost window of the ruin. A caretaker swore he saw two small silhouettes standing side by side, their joined hands outlined in a pale glow. When he blinked, the window was empty, but the impression lingered, a quiet certainty that something had watched him watch them. The skeletons now rest in a climate-controlled vault, catalogued and studied, but the question remains like a splinter beneath the skin of Providence. Has the curse been broken, or merely lulled into sleep? On windless nights, when the tide creeps high and the moon hangs thin, those who pass the bluff still claim they hear it, the soft rattle of chains, the almost imperceptible murmur of children breathing in the dark, waiting for the world to forget once more.